I'm Phil Baker, Vice President of Boyd Insurance and Investment Services, and also Vice Chairman of the Public Policy and Small Business Division of Manatee Chamber of Commerce. I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your mobile devices. Before we get started, I would like to ask you to all please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Please be seated. We have a number of elected officials in the audience today I'd like to introduce to you. If you would, please hold your applause to the end. Clerk of the Court, Angel Colaneso. Judge Renee Inman. Judge Gilbert Smith, State Representative Jim Boyd, Manatee County Commissioner Vanessa Ball. Okay, we'll try to catch her on the rebound there. Manatee County Commissioner Betsy Benak, Manatee County Commissioner Steve Johnson, Manatee County Commissioner Charles Smith, Manatee County Commissioner Priscilla Trace, and Manatee County Commissioner Carol Whitmore. We also have Danum Alvarez for Senator Bill Nelson's office. Sorry. Thank you. Okay, did I miss anyone? Okay, well, thank you all very much for coming and for your service. We'd like to thank our sponsors for today's event. They're always very faithful in allowing us to have such great headliner presentations. Sons Insurance, the Mosaic Company, and Center State Bank. Center State Bank has just come on board with the Chamber of Commerce as a platinum member, so we're very thankful for that, and thank you very much to our sponsors. Well, we all know why we're here, and Dr. MacManus does not need any introduction, but I'll give you a few comments. She is the leading expert on the politics in Florida, is nationally known for her expert and incisive commentary on public opinion and intergenerational politics. Dr. MacManus has authored numerous public books, including co-authoring Politics in States and Communities, the nation's leading textbook on state and local politics. She is also a Florida native, and along with her mother, are the authors of several local Florida history books. Dr. MacManus received her MA from the University of Michigan and PhD from Florida State University, and is a distinguished university professor emeritus at University of South Florida in the Department of Government and International Affairs. As Florida's most quoted political scientist, Dr. MacManus has appeared on every major broadcast and every cable television and radio network, and has been interviewed by major newspapers in Florida, the United States, and abroad. Please help me in welcoming Dr. MacManus.
I'm just a country girl from Pasco County, so I was telling my table mates, I love this area because it brings back a lot of childhood memories. Every summer we would go for a week to Sanibel and drive down 41 and always stop to see Snooty at the museum. And so I've always had a real affinity for the area. And now one of my very best students is from here as well. So anyway, let's talk politics. I know that's what you want to do, right? So what we're seeing in Florida right now is what we're seeing across the country. Again, our bellwether status is intact, to put it mildly. And our state is getting more powerful by the day. Just a little bit of an aside, we're projected to get at least 2 more congressional seats after the next redistricting, after the next census. And we're going to see that we're key to what happens in Washington, which party controls both the House and the Senate. Our state is really critical, this midterm election. And of course, many more women and minorities are running. A lot of that's coming from younger generations. It reflects the fact that more women and minorities are getting college educated and getting into the world of politics. Activism is on the upswing. Most of the activism you see is related to social and economic injustices. And of course, identity politics, and we'll see each party has some pretty strong identity politics in terms of its base. And of course, what we knew was always going to come, the conflict between the boomers and the millennials. So going into this election, there were a number of reasons why everyone was projecting this huge tsunami blue wave. Most of these are known to you. The president's party almost always loses seats in a midterm election, and usually means only 3 times when they haven't. And this one especially, the party that wins the popular vote but loses the Electoral College is always more fired up. That's the case, of course. And you see, Democrats are tired of losing, and they want to win back the control of the U.S. House and the Senate, and Florida's key to that. Plus, over the last 8 years, Democrats lost tons of governorships and most state legislative chambers, and the party itself was committed this time out to really putting a lot of emphasis on attracting candidates and whatever. So this was the reason why we saw the blue wave predictions. It isn't really turning out like that. It's not going to be a tsunami. It's still going to see blue seats coming along. But there are some reasons that we'll see why it's not going to be that way in Florida, where Democrats run the table. It is interesting that for the first time in a long time, even though we have our primary in August, which most people say, why do you ever hold one in August? Try to campaign to people and get them interested in politics in August in Florida is a challenge, but it went up from 18 to 27%. That's a pretty big jump. So we are expecting a jump in turnout for this November, and that's not surprising to you. Our Senate race right now is a toss-up. It's critical for both parties. Democrats do not want to lose the Senate seat that they have here. It's key, holding on is key to Democrats taking back over control of the U.S. Senate. Republicans want nothing better than to take it away, because now, believe it or not, they're worried about losing Texas. So you see all the kinds of calculations going on, and there are 10 states that are really critical, and all it takes is a flip of 5, to really change the Senate, actually a little bit less than that. And you see the states involved. It's the Midwest, and of course it's the Southwest and Florida. These, just to remind you of what the primary looked like. The areas where Gillum won are the really dark blue areas, and the lighter blue was Gwen Graham territory, and Phil Levine was on the far southwest coast, and a lot of that was because of the algae bloom issue, which he articulated, and it's really bad there, and they're not used to having it that bad in that area. In terms of the Republicans, you can see the areas. Putnam was the blue, DeSantis was the red. The really heavily agricultural areas went for Putnam, just to refresh your memory a little bit about that. But guess what? Our governor's race is also a toss-up. The polls are narrowed now. It's again right back to a tie. It's really, really hard to predict how this one's going. But I will tell you that it's the governor's race that's exciting Floridians. It's not the Senate race, I'm sorry. But the real draw in terms of energizing people and new voters and so forth seems to be the governor's race. And again, it's because of a lot of the generational shifts. Think of it, the 2 governor's candidates are 39 years of age. And I don't know what the 2 senators, the governor and the Senate are in 70s, I believe. But well-known people, and the energizing is coming from, as we'll see here, the younger part of our population. Again, as I said, we're one of a state that's going to get, Texas is going to get more seats than we are, but with all the 1,000 people moving in here all the time, we're going to get 2 more seats at a minimum, which makes the stakes even higher. And it also, I remind you that the next governor will have veto power over the redistricting plan, the congressional redistricting plan. So our ties to national politics are getting even stronger as we get bigger, and we're critical to party control in the U.S. Congress. We have some fascinating cabinet races, too. They're not getting very much attention. When you have a governor's race and a Senate race in the same year, all the money and all the interest pretty much goes there. But as you know, these three positions are very, very critical, and the cabinet plays a big role in many of the executive agencies of our state. The most interesting one in terms of most attention is the AG race. And of course, both of those candidates are from our area. And when I say our area, I'm talking about the Tampa media market, of which Manatee County is one of the 10 counties. The CFO race, you see the first ad went up on that. And the Commissioner of Agriculture really kind of boils down to marijuana versus traditional ag. Nikki Fried is running on a straight marijuana kind of platform, and Caldwell is more traditional, but you don't hear about either one of them. And what I'm expecting is that you're going to see a lot of straight line party voting. If somebody votes Democrat, they're probably just going to vote Democrat, or Republican, just go down the line on these cabinet races. But it's, in some ways, in other years, some of these might have gotten more attention, but just under the circumstance, they're just not getting a whole lot, but they are very important. So let's look at what our electorate looks like. And this is why Florida is the epicenter of politics. The last four elections, 2010, 2014, and 2012 and 2016, the winner has only prevailed by 1%. And right now, if I were to predict today, I would say we're in another 1% scenario, especially on our governor's race, and probably on our Senate as well. And this is, again, no other state in the country looks like this, I can assure you. It's why it costs so much money to run here and so forth. But anyway, looking at the current partisan makeup in the legislature and Congress, again, you'll see why there's just such an interest in Florida. And I should have said, by the way, the morning after our primary, the first call I got was from a newspaper in Belgium, and the second one was from a newspaper in Argentina. That's Florida in its international interest, seriously. But right now, in terms of the legislature, as you know, the legislatures control both houses by the Republicans. And projections, and we'll show you some, there are hopes among Democrats that if they could take back one of those chambers, their hope is for taking back the Florida Senate, not the House, even though they've identified about 13 seats that they thought they might be able to flip on the House. The congressional is very, very competitive. Again, this is why there's such national attention, is that it only takes 23 House seats in the whole country to switch, and the Democrats will control the U.S. House. If we look at Florida's competitive state Senate seats, again, this is a chamber that Democrats think they have a shot at taking back. You'll notice that only one of those, actually most of those are in our area, with the exception of 8, which is Gainesville, and 36, which is South Florida. The other 3 competitive state Senate races are right here in the I-4 corridor, and particularly in the Tampa market. But this is what is interesting nationally. And again, Florida is absolutely critical to helping Democrats take back control of the House, which some people think is more likely than taking control of the U.S. Senate. But anyway, only one of these races here is where Republicans think they can take back a Democratic one, and that's the Stephanie Murphy House seat over in Orlando area. That's competitive, but I think Murphy probably might pull that one out. The rest of these are all Democrats taking on Republicans and thinking that they can flip them. There's a lot of interest, but again, the Buchanan race is right around here. The Spano-Kristen Carlson race is here. Again, I-4 corridor is really very obvious. South Florida, is very hard. Right now, Democrats are counting heavily on 26 and 27, but Donna Shalala is actually losing to Salazar, and that's kind of an interesting thing because Salazar, this was Ross Layton's seat, and Democrats really, really thought they could take that one back. Well, we'll see. And Corbello, Mercarsel Powell is also very close. But anyway, let's look at who Florida's voters are. Some of you have seen this before. It's troubling to both major parties because the upswing is not in either party's share of the registered voters, but of that green line, which is no party affiliation. And 28% right now are registered NPA or minor party. But of the 28, 27 are NPAs and only one is minor party. The biggest one is the Libertarians. So both parties are worried, and we're going to see this as an age connection, that they're going to have to adjust some way, or it's really hard to figure out how to reach these NPAs. The registration difference between Democrats and Republicans is the narrowest in Florida history, just a couple percentage points difference. And frankly, when you look at the Panhandle, which is registered Democrat but votes Republican a lot in state elections, it's fairly even. But again, a big portion NPAs. This is a huge story to understanding the transformation of Florida that's been taking place over the last couple decades, but it's escalating now, is the fact that over a third of our registered voters are non-white. And particularly, I have you focus on Hispanics are 16% and blacks, not Hispanic blacks, but blacks, 13%. However, it is true in Florida that blacks far have higher turnout than Hispanics. So you could say that those two groups are somewhat at parity as well. But I think what's interesting to our state is these terms do a disservice to politics. If you say Hispanic in Florida, what does it mean? It's very diverse. It's Cubans, it's Puerto Ricans, it's Mexicans, it's Venezuelans, it's Colombians, it's Dominicans. And they do not all see eye to eye politically or register in the same way. And that's another thing that makes our electorate so fascinating to people outside the state. You know, these TV groups love to come into Florida. You can get a flavor of everything right here in the Tampa Bay market. But what we don't see as much here that's also quite interesting is Florida has one of the most diverse black populations. And a lot of that is due to the influx from the Caribbean of blacks, and that is most noticed in South Florida. But if you look right here, there's no other state whose racial and ethnic makeup looks closer to the national average than ours. And this is, again, what is so fascinating about our state. Again, it has solidified our bellwether status as sort of being, as Florida goes, so goes the nation. And it's been that way in every presidential election except one or two in the last half century. But here's the story I really want to drive home to you is the changing age makeup of our registrants. The under 30 plus 30 to 49-year-olds make up currently 46% of the electorate. And the new numbers will be out in about a week and a half because tomorrow is the last day to register to vote, and there have been some very aggressive registration drives underway across the state. I don't think the percentages will change all that much, but anyway, it's very, very interesting, and this is compelling. Look at the intersection between race and ethnicity and age. So among Florida's current registered voters who are under 30 years of age, just 50% are white. In contrast, look at the 65 and over, it's 75%, 76% white. So the intersection between race and age is very strong. Diversity is one thing that a lot of younger people, it's one of their values. And you can see that in some of the patterns that we've seen in voting so far. I know you can't see this in the back, but let me just tell you that the best way to look at age is through generations instead of just chronological age, because life's experience as a group becomes mature, meaning 18 years of age, is very different from one generation to the next, and so too are the presidents that have covered the span of that generation as it's turned 18. You'll see here that, and let's see how many we have here right now. Raise your hand if you're anybody from the greatest generation, meaning you're 91 or older. I had one the other day. It was shocking, really. I did. How about silent generation, 73 to 90? Okay, baby boomers, 54 to 72. All right. Generation X, 38 to 53. All right. Millennials, 22 to 37. This is a really age diverse. Okay. And the newest generation, which Pew Research Center just put a cut point to millennials. It's called Generation Z. To me, it's the hashtag generation. But let me just contrast the baby boomers. We always knew that millennials were a bigger group, but now they're maturing politically and they are changing politics in this state everywhere. But I contrast the baby boomers, the items that really affected them, civil rights movement, the youth culture, the whole Save the World activism. We've come full circle now. The activism is back on college campuses. And you see here, drugs, free love, all that, and the different presidents. But if you look at the millennials, and you've got 9/11, social media, Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, the Great Recession, and the BP oil spill, it gives you an idea why the environment has escalated as a consistently important issue in our state. It's that younger generation. They are even calling it the environmental generation. But also, if you look at both the millennials, Generation Y and Z, they've only known two presidents, one from each party. And they don't like what they see in Washington. And that's what's happening in Washington has turned their back on, the traditional party, so to speak. Now, in terms of millennials and Gen Xers, you see here, millennials and hashtag, you'll see that a quarter of the registered voters are millennials plus this younger generation. But if I combine, this is critical, the Generation X, the millennials, and this new hashtag generation, this is current data. 52% of Florida's registered voters are the three youngest generations. This is where the candidates are coming from. This is why the issues are changing. It's why how you have to get across your message to different generations. You can't use one size fits all anymore. It doesn't work politically. And it makes it more challenging for people who have to run for office, especially someone engaged in a statewide contest. So you see this is very vivid. And of course, activism. The big activism movements all have a strong hook to Florida. For example, Black Lives Matter. Much of it was sparked by the Trayvon Martin scenario and still motivated by that issue. On the far left is the sexual harassment. I had the wonderful opportunity as an analyst to be in Washington for the inauguration and followed by the Me Too movement March on Washington. Nothing like seeing the gamut of politics in 3 days' time. But there was a very, very large delegation from Florida, and it's still very active. Then you see the DACA, the Children of Undocumented Immigrants, a large portion of that battle, Florida. And more recently, the Parkland, the Never Again, that movement is a Florida hook through the Parkland shootings. So again, if you wonder why we are so important, you can see all the political things that tie us to national politics at this moment. Here just shows you that the younger you are, the more likely you are to register as a no-party affiliation. And these new 18 to 21-year-olds, almost 40%, are choosing to be NPA rather than a party. Women are a majority of Florida's registered voters, 53%. The unknowns are 3, and let me talk about that a little bit because Florida is probably going to experience something that we've already seen in a couple other states, and that is a move to make gender non-binary, but to have multiple categories. Certain other states out west have come up with transgender and other kinds of things. And so even though that's a small percent right now, you're starting to see this on campuses, this whole movement about that coming along. It is true that women make up a much larger share of registered Democrats than Republicans. Among Republicans, there's 18% more registered female Democrats than male. And while you might have thought that would be the key to Gwen Graham winning the primary, the issue there was that a huge portion of those women, those black women, Democratic women, are women of color, especially black women. And they were committed to Gillum as opposed to Graham. So you can't always just assume a one for one. You got to look at the intersection of these different characteristics. Republicans, majority women. Minor parties, your libertarians, heavily men. NPAs, a little bit more evenly up. Where do people live? 45% of all of the state's registered voters live in the I-4 corridor. That's why you get to see so many TV ads. And you happen to be sitting in the biggest one of all 10 media markets in Florida. 24%, almost 1/4 then, of all Florida's registered voters are in the Tampa television market, which is why we see the candidates all the time. Think of it, if you get on TV, local TV, if you're in town as a candidate, you're surely going to, or on the radio, you're going to reach 1/4 of the registrants. And followed by Orlando, and of course that's why they call it, the highway to heaven or hell on I-4. Some of you heard me say this before, but I drive I-4 enough to know it's always hell, so. Miami was usually number 2 behind Tampa until the 2016 election, and then the growth in Orlando and the I-4 corridor in general. And by the way, I didn't put these stats up here, but those 2 media markets out of all 10 are the most evenly divided by party and by age and by race and ethnicity. They're very competitive, and that's, again, what makes them the swing part of the swing state, as we say. It's also true that you have to pay attention to who lives where. Everyone that runs for office knows that. But there's tremendous variation in the percentage of population that's non-white. If you look at Miami, just 31% of the registered voters in the Miami media market are Anglos. And you see the heavy percentage there, 40% Hispanic. And you go down the line, you can see the heavily markets which have the largest concentration of black voters, which would be Miami area. Again, we've talked about Caribbean blacks as well as native-borns. But then you look at Tallahassee and Jacksonville. In other words, the Panhandle, the old south part of the state, larger black populations. But this is, again, you can't campaign the same way, and different candidates appeal. Because a lot of people do vote according to, especially minorities are more likely to vote for a minority candidate, especially one who's running for the first time. This is how Floridians describe themselves ideologically. You see here that it's a pretty good mix. Conservatives 35, moderates 36, liberals 22. And frankly, the fastest growing group right now are liberals. And you want to know why? Younger voters, okay. Let's look at Florida Democrats. It is true that a majority of Florida Democrats are minorities. And I think a lot of people don't realize that. So just 48% of Florida's registered Democrats are white. The rest are a mixture, but you also see a 5% which would be biracial, and you're seeing more and more biracial relationships and friendships and whatever, especially among younger voters. Nearly half of all Democrats are under age 50. They're younger. And here are the base constituencies of Florida Democrats. These are the ones, if you talk about identity politics and so forth, these are the groups that make up the largest portion of Florida Democrats, and of course there's overlap amongst them, but Not surprising, women, minorities, including the new Puerto Ricans, the younger voters, the LGBTQ community, and public employee unions, and Jewish voters. Some of you may have seen a really good story the other day about the large Jewish vote down in South Florida. I think one of the papers here ran it recently. 2/3 of Florida Democrats live in 3 media markets, number 1 being Miami-Fort Lauderdale area, followed by Tampa, followed by Orlando. But even if you go down and you see Gainesville with 2% and Panama City 2% and all that, you realize if you win by 1%, you can't exclude any part of Florida. And we have histories of where statewide candidates have ignored a part of the state and lost. For example, Charlie Crist lost a statewide race because he only visited Duval County, Jacksonville once. Democrats are not making that mistake this time out. But that's the kind of thing you can't really, with 1%, really leave out any part of the state. These are the big issues for Florida Democrats right now. These are not in any kind of chronological or order of ranking. Education issues are anti-charter and better pay for school teachers. The environmental issues are very strong, and of course algae bloom and red tide. The economy issues for Democrats are minimum wage of 15, plus trying to narrow the income gap that exists between the wealthiest and poorest parts of our state. Healthcare, they're really emphasizing pre-existing conditions and a more anti-Republican view of healthcare right now. Gun control, I don't need to say much. Minority voting rights is reflected in a big push for vote yes on Amendment 4, which is the automatic restoration of felon voting rights. Criminal justice has to do with jail sentencing terms, immigration, of course, you know that. And in our area, transportation and infrastructure is a big issue because of the congestion. And it's always funny because when people are coming here in droves, everybody wants fewer people to come, and then when we're having a recession, they want more people to come. And it's really hard to plan transportation in this state. And of course, one of the biggest issues is the president. In terms of Florida's Republicans, now keep in mind there's just 2% difference between the two. It's just that Democrats are concentrated in our urban areas and Republicans more in the suburban and rural parts of our state. And you see the differences here. Rural voters have very high turnout and they're conservative. The highest turnout county in the primary was Liberty County. If some of you don't know where it is, it's up there, okay? Older voters, which are super voters, Hispanics, notice I also mentioned that they're aggressively going after Puerto Ricans. This is a fascinating study because both parties are aiming at trying to win over these newly arrived Puerto Ricans to try and stave off the further deterioration of their registration. So they're looking long ball in terms of registering. Both parties have aggressive outreach groups to try to register these new arrivees, but we are now learning that the number was not nearly as large as initially projected, which was 300,000. It doesn't come close to that. We're also seeing a lot of things that show that a number of them are just not interested in politics, still trying to put their life back together. That's why I am, as an analyst, convinced their real impact is going to be in the 2020 presidential more than it is this year, except for some of the local races around the Orlando area. But definitely aggressive outreach. Suburban voters, this is a group I always watch. It's suburban women with kids, and I'm talking about middle to lower income suburban women with children. This is also a group that swings one way or the other. If you look at presidential election voting patterns, these suburban women fluctuate. They have voted lean towards Obama in one of his elections and Trump towards the last one. They swing, and it often has to do with things that affect their children. So we're watching them because this time they have, of course, the gun issue and school safety. But you also have, and this is very interesting, I know somebody's going to ask me about the Kavanaugh situation. It is cutting very differently as to whether you have, if you're a mom, whether you have male children, teenagers or females. There's a little bit of difference there. It's a hard group to monitor, but it's definitely a group that is, the married woman vote can tip, the suburban married woman vote is what I'm saying, can tip in either party's direction depending upon the issues. And of course, gun owners and ag and working class whites and small business owners. Republicans are more white, they're older, and half of them live in the I-4 corridor. And number one here is Tampa with 25%. The big issues for Florida Republicans, the economy and taxes and tariffs, socialism, which works well with older voters, younger voters haven't a clue what it means. And I'm being serious, they don't know what it means. Ask somebody what it means. Older voters know that, okay? Education, their school choice, tougher diminishing government regs, Second Amendment, opioids, of course, tough on border security and religious freedom, and the environmental issue that's pushing a lot of Republicans, depending on the part of state you're in, is invasive species. And all you have to do, if you haven't driven through Polk County lately and looked at the orange industry, the citrus industry, my family lost everything as a consequence. I think I pushed it again the other way here. You're going to have to, and I was pushing right, so I don't know what's, this mouse is funky. But anyway, it's really fascinating to see how different issues affect different parts of the state. And so that thank you, sir, invasive species puts them at odds with some other environmentalists who are really want better protection of animals and so forth. See, I'm pushing right. It keeps, okay, NPAs, here we go. This is a group you really want to pay attention to. This is that fast-growing group called no party affiliations. And look at it, under 30 and 30 to 49 is 58%. That's they're just not liking the two parties. This one is significant because something else I didn't tell you about Puerto Ricans. New arrivals from the island usually register as no party affiliation because they don't know what a Democrat or Republican is. And they don't understand federalism. I had 2 students from Puerto Rico last semester, and they said when a Puerto Rican looks at all the things you got to vote for, a county commissioner, a school board, a legislator, a congressional, they're used to, presidential elections. And so it's just the complexity kind of, is another reason that they don't vote necessarily in midterms. But 22% of registrants, NPAs, are Hispanic compared to just 8% of blacks. And of course the gender is split. NPAs live where everybody else lives. This is the message I want to leave with you today, and it's not a good one for our country. Fewer and fewer people have any belief in our political institutions, and they don't believe the media. And you ask, well, who do they believe? And it's very curious. But anyway, this is a problem. And look at this. Media bias is a big part of the problem. The perception over a majority can't name one source that they think reports the news objectively. Think of that. It is horrible. And the bias on media not separating fact from opinion. So a great quote yesterday in one of the analyses of what's going on in Washington about the fact that, and it was a communications blog that said this is one of the big problems that media is facing is a lot of the newspapers and whatever that have been losing viewers or whatever, they want their reporters to get on television to try and ramp up interest, and as soon as you move from news to opinion, you start to lose your credibility and believability as a news person, and this is what's happening. I tell my students in media and politics, if you don't learn anything else in my class, learn this. Media is a business. Don't forget it. Okay. But anyway, the good news for all of you that are interested in running for office and are in office, you know this, people trust local media a lot more than they trust the national. They trust local newspapers. They trust local television. Candidates are better served to be interviewed by a local anchor than a national news anchor when it comes to running for a statewide office, because people trust their local reporters more. This is the crisis that we're having in terms of where people are going for news about politics. Newspapers down, cable down, network TV down, local TV morning stuff down, and even digital news is starting to go down. The only one that hasn't changed is radio. It's very interesting. But again, people aren't going to traditional news sources. Here's my point about anybody running for office this year. This is the hardest year ever to get your message across to potential voters and supporters. Why? People don't trust the news. They don't trust politicians. And you can't figure out where to go get your message, and all the negative ads. At this point, I don't think very many people are watching ads on television. The TV stations love them, however, as you might imagine. But anyway, this is loss of faith in our governing institutions and our press is not good for this country. And what we just witnessed in the Senate scene, confirmation scene, wasn't helping any of this. Now, I know we had some people here that went to the canvassing board, but right now, the toughest job in politics is with your county supervisor of elections. Look at all the challenges that they have. And if you haven't read the 12 amendments, you better allow yourself about an hour to go through them and read the real thing, not just the ballot summary. Greater distrust of the integrity of the voting, greater likelihood of lawsuits because there's going to be some very close elections. This is close. Florida's just close. Every kind of thing that can go wrong. I always tell people, don't expect perfect elections. When you have people and you have equipment, neither one of them is perfect. And I gave a talk to some journalists the other day, and I told them, don't run out and run to the cell phone and run to whatever when a machine doesn't work in one precinct in one county, you know. Then you keep other people from showing up. It's not helpful because most of the time, and almost always now, they fix it very quickly. Turnout, this is a difference typically between a presidential and a midterm election. We're thinking, I don't think we'll get beyond the mid-50s, maybe close to 60, but I don't think so. It's still a lot lower than a presidential turnout in a midterm usually. So this is what's made predicting so difficult. When I went back and I looked at all the things that have happened at a time so dominated news that we were convinced that nothing else could possibly be the point of conversation in an election until, by November of 2018. A year ago, a little over a year ago, we were talking about the Confederate monuments. Then it went to Hurricane Irma and all that. Then the Me Too hashtag. Then the women's marches. Then the shooting at Stoneman Douglas. Then the separation of children from their parents at the border. Then the algae bloom. All of these are hashtag events. Now, of course, we had an October surprise in September, which was the Kavanaugh confirmation stuff. And there's still 3 weeks to go. And if you vote early and something strange happens, well, oh well. But this is why, this shows you the power of the news and changing the subject and what people are focused on, and why it's so difficult for politicians really who have the heart, they're running for the right reasons and they want to do well for their people, why it is so hard for them to find a message that can break through a lot of this negativism. But I'm going to end with this slide, which I know is absolutely true. Once again, we're going to be close. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. I'll let Dr. MacManus pick her persons.
Oh, no, I don't like that. But
You want me to do it?
yeah, you pick.
Okay, great. Right here.
Hi. So the purpose of especially the U.S. House is to compromise to bring things that really help society as a whole. What do you attribute the big divide and the inability to compromise on really any issues?
Here's the issue. How many of you took intro political science at one point in your life? You probably remember that great graphic in there, at least I think it's great, which is a normal distribution, the normal curve. Here's the issue right now, and this is a very good question. The steeper that is, and the closer the two parties are in terms of size, the more they vote a straight party line, and they're hanging on for dear life. And that's what you see right now, is very few are willing to cross the party line. And I get very disturbed because your point, if you look at the history of our country, it was formed on the basis of compromise between the big states and the small states. which you still have that conflict a bit. But now the C word, compromise, has become a negative. And again, I think some of it is when one party reaches across the aisle to the other and it's a big high media event, it's almost always the case that the person that gave in is cast as weak and caving in, and that's not helpful. And and I think cable TV has also had a lot to do with polarizing our country. You tell me what cable TV you watch incessantly, I can probably guess your politics. Most of the time, not always. The same thing with what kind of radio you listen to, and again, what kind of newspapers you read. But it's very sad, but it's also, I think, reaching the breaking point, which is why you're seeing these younger people say, no more. And if you look historically at changes that kind of right the system, because it's not righted right now, and I'm not speaking about ideological direction, it usually comes from an organized group that's had enough and forces the parties to change, or they continue to, they ultimately get eliminated. I see the seeds of that with this millennial and hashtag generation. And you see it in their registration.
Okay. I have another question.
It is the case that we have 5 ways that we can amend the Constitution in our Constitution. One is a Constitutional Convention. We never had that. One is by the legislature. They put 3 of the amendments on the ballot. Another is by the Tax and Budget Reform Commission, which meets every 20 years. Another is by the Constitutional Revision Commission, which is what put a lot of these on here. And there's a lot of politics behind that. And most of them are what they call bundle. They got 2 or 3 subjects in the same one that makes it difficult. And the 5th one is through people signing petitions. And we have a couple of those on the ballot. But the bulk of them on there have been put there through the Constitutional Revision Commission, which is in the Constitution. And they were running tight at the end, their timetable, and they had 22 amendments on the table, but various members had proposed and met a threshold. And at the end, they decided to bundle a couple of them. Well, actually 6. There's 3 that are still under consideration for review for rejecting by the Florida Supreme Court, but they're on the ballots because ballots have had to be moved out. There's one that they rejected, which was number 8, which was a very confusing thing about school governance. And there's just a couple of them that are really single issue kinds of amendments. So I can tell you right now, because the hardest presentation I've had to give this year was last week to the Hillsborough County Bar Association on all 12 of these amendments. And there were some I had to read 10 times. And even then, and the average person is going to read the title and a little bit of the summary. What we're wondering about this time, though, usually Florida has a history of people voting on them. Other states have what we call a large roll-off, where people just skip them. You've got 2 different things going on right now. They're at the end of a very long ballot, one of the longest ballots ever in Florida. And secondly, you have some groups that are out there saying just vote no on all of them. They don't belong in the Constitution. So I'm kind of thinking that we might have a little bit higher roll-off this time than usual, or people skipping the amendments or just voting on a couple of them and then saying, forget it, I've got to go, I'm over it. It is a disservice to people because, honestly, there's one. If you read the dog racing amendment and read the full amendment, there's nowhere, and the advertising on number 3 on gambling, there is nowhere close to reality on either one of those 2 if you read the whole ballot, the proposed amendment itself, but most people won't do that. It's very time-consuming and very legalistic. Lawyers write these things, and everyday people can't understand them, so.
Great, John.
There's about 10 of them out there, but I can tell you a couple of them that I think are very thorough. One, that's the League of Women Voters. Secondly, there's a new blog called The Phoenix. These are both more liberal-leaning blog, but both of those are very detailed. On the other side, an excellent analyses by, and a lot of times they're on the same page. I mean, just giving you different viewpoints. Tax Watch has a good one, and so does the James Madison Institute. But the ones that are in the papers where they do a one sentence just because of space and most people don't look at anything, I think that's really a disservice. These are very complex amendments.
Ballotpedia, do you like that one?
One of my students does that, Ballotpedia for Florida, so yes, I would say so. Third parties are always difficult because they only come to energy when it's an election time, and parties are built from the bottom up. But what I do anticipate is a constitutional initiative, a citizens' initiative drive to collect signatures to put the idea of an open primary as a constitutional amendment before the voters in 2020. I think you're going to see some, because obviously if you're registered in PA, you can't vote in a primary. And some argue that when when a large bulk can't vote in the primary, that party activists are more on the ideological ends of the spectrum, and that's why you get candidates that are seemingly on the end, too right or too left, and then have to try to come to the middle. It'll be interesting. Polling that we've done through the Sunshine State Survey at USF shows a strong support for open primaries among the average person, but parties don't like it because it limits their ability to control who bears their party's label onto the ballot. But third parties just are almost impossible. You got to have a lot of money and you got to have it really organized early on. I think your better approaches are moving the parties in one direction or another. If they lose and they don't adjust, they lose. Yes, very simply. Truly partisan competition in the governor's race on both sides of the aisle. The governor's race, as I said, is going to drive the turnout. Does that mean that the Senate race is not critical? It is very critical. You can see the reasons that we gave it, and the stakes are high, and both candidates are well known, and both parties are pouring tons of money into that race. It's very interesting. A lot more money is coming in from outside Florida in some of these races than inside. The stakes are high, the PACs are active, the parties in the Congress are active. Everybody is trying to help out. I think you're seeing, frankly, a lot better grassroots mobilization of everyday people. To me, TV ads don't carry the weight they used to. And a few years ago, Alcee Hastings, who's a Congress member from South Florida, chided Hillary Clinton campaign for wasting too much money on TV ads and not enough on getting people to register folks and working on the grassroots, making sure that people know how to vote. This is another thing I tell a lot of groups that register people. It's easy to register someone, but a lot of people that have never done it, it's confusing. It's almost like you have to take them and mentor them. How do you vote? What does this mean? You have to educate them about actually casting a ballot. It's not as simple as it seems to you and I, to somebody who's brand new to this whole thing called voting. Registration is the easy part of it. Getting them out to vote and having them vote correctly, meaning not marring a ballot, is difficult. Many of you have heard me say I do not think the polling currently in Florida is very good. A lot of it is done by firms that just have a very small, and including some university polls, not ours, thank you. But, it's definitely, the sample size are too small and so forth. Here's my issue that I would love to have this data. We have a big nagging fear that what you're seeing in polling is what we saw with the Trump, people keeping their mouths shut, because there is this demonization of people who are going to vote for conservative people. I mean, I saw a little bit of that on campus. My Republican students kept quiet, and the Democrats were always engaged and so forth. But here's the point. Everywhere that I speak to Republican groups, everywhere, and I speak to Democratic ones just equally, the Republicans tell me they won't answer polls. And I would like to see, because until I see this, I don't have a lot of confidence. I want to see the response rate broken down by party. Democrats right now are very happy to tell you everything. They're gunned up and ready to go. Not gunned up, but geared up and ready to go. Let me clarify that right away. Republicans are a little bit quieter. Some of it's the age thing. But with it so close like that, you know, you just don't know. And I think it's going to be, the polls are going to kind of be closed till the end, so we don't know. I think that's what makes this race. I'm expecting a long night, election night. And, you know, again, tremendous national interest. On the way down here, I spoke to a woman from the Christian Science Monitor, just spent a week here in Florida. And I just speak to one national reporter after another. MSNBC is coming to our campus on Friday. I mean, it's just, Florida's just so interesting. As always, I usually end every talk with saying, thank God I'm a political scientist here and not North Dakota. It'd be really boring, you know. Except North Dakota's kind of interesting at the moment, but not like Florida, never. I do think we're in the middle of this civil war where people can't be civil to each other, let alone, but it's deeply partisan. And you see what happened in the Senate confirmation, just when I was asked to analyze it, I said it just, you know, deepened even more than it already is, the staunch partisan divide that we see. I think it's going to take a long time for this country to heal, but education and community conversations and engaging with younger people, my best success as a professor was the last 3 or 4 years I taught, because I taught seniors and half mass communication and half poli-sci. And I would break them, of course I taught at night, it would be 3 hours, and I'd lecture the first hour, and then we would do something. And I've divided them into groups, they stayed with their whole group the whole time, and I set it up so their groups were diverse. And nothing pleased me more at the end of the semester in reading my evaluations than to see students say, I loved the groups, I learned things about others that I would never have learned. And they got to be friends, and you could see. And probably one of the best things I guess I ever had was to bring Danny Burgess, who's a Republican and one of my former students, to class with Sean Shaw. And they were both in the legislature at the time. And what the students told me as they left that evening was, I didn't realize Democrats could talk to Republicans and vice versa. This is the imagery they have. How do we fix that? We mingle more, we create environments and events and so forth where the young and the old, they have to start talking to each other. And it's also true, people say, well, younger people are only interested in younger politicians, to which I always answer Bernie Sanders. Not always, you know, they're young. People are inspiring, and young people are always looking for professional mentors, absolutely. And I had a lot of mine, I required them to work in a campaign. I didn't care who. And they, oh, I don't want to do that, you know. I said, well, you can write a 25-page term paper if you'd like instead. No, I'll take the politics. There again, the experience was uplifting. They got to know people. They got networking. They learned about, you know, somebody can help you out, sitting next to an older person that could explain things. Internships, it all comes together. I've long been, because I've been studying generational politics almost my whole life, intergenerational programs are essential now in light of the changing age makeup of our country, essential. And, you know, if you're an older person, think of how you feel with a young grandchild. That kind of energy, and young grandchildren loving to go to grandma or granddaddy's house or whatever. We got to get back to some of this talking to each other. But unfortunately, I think part of the fix is what itself has to be fixed, and that's the American media at the moment. And I say that as a media analyst, but I think that there's too much gotcha and not enough information in terms of our political news. Thank you all for having me. I really appreciate it. Thank you.